Good evening, my friend. I am really glad you are here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Let the light around you dim a little. Let the noise of the day fade into the background, and give yourself permission to slow down. Because the story we are stepping into is not loud or chaotic. It moves gently, like fog rolling through an old city. Tonight, we are traveling back to the Victorian era, a world shaped by coal fires, narrow streets, gas lamps, thick mist, and families doing everything they could to survive another day. And in that world, parents sometimes reached for remedies that to us might feel strange, but to them were simply part of life. Not shocking, not unusual, just a tool they relied on when the nights grew long and the children restless. To understand that world, we have to walk into it slowly, like stepping into a room lit only by candlelight. Imagine the soft crunch of boots on damp cobblestones as we enter a narrow London lane in the late 1800s. The lamps glow faintly, their warm halos swallowed by the fog drifting between rows of brick houses. Somewhere nearby, a cartwheel creaks, accompanied by the distant cough of a child waking before dawn. This world looks quiet, but its quiet is not restful. It is the silence of tired families, of workers who rise before sunrise, of parents who know the next day will demand more of them than the last. Inside one of these houses, perhaps the one with smoke trickling gently from its chimney, or the one with curtains thin enough for streetlight to slip through, a mother is already awake. The air in the house is cold. The fire has died down. The windows leak drafts. She moves slowly, careful not to wake the children still sleeping in their shared bed. Her hands are rough from washing clothes. Her back aches from bending over basins. But she does not pause. This is simply her routine, repeated every day in every season. One of her younger children has been restless for nights, teething, perhaps, or frightened by the constant cold. When a child cries in this house, the entire family wakes. 3 siblings share one bed. Another sleeps on a cot near the kitchen. The father, who must leave early for work, is already teetering on the edge of exhaustion. In homes like this, rest is not a luxury. It is precious fuel for survival. The mother knows that if tonight mirrors the last 3 nights, tomorrow will be a struggle. The older children will drag themselves through school or work. The father may not manage his shift. She herself will fall behind on washing, mending, and cleaning, and falling behind even a little can be dangerous. There is no safety net in her world, no margin for error. And so, when she reaches for the small glass bottle on her shelf, it is not a careless act. It is a decision shaped by exhaustion, necessity, and the constant pressure of life lived on thin edges. The bottle is simple, amber-colored, with elegant handwriting on a faded label, promising peaceful nights and happier infants. Next to it sits a small tin of sweets sold at the corner shop, tiny candies meant for calming children during difficult evenings. To her, these remedies are not strange. They are part of the rhythm of the neighborhood, shared between mothers, recommended by shopkeepers, praised in newspaper advertisements, and trusted because the people around her trust them. She dips a spoon into the syrup, lifts her child gently, and hums a soft tune. The baby relaxes, the crying slows, and for the first time in hours, maybe days, the house settles into stillness. That moment of quiet must have felt like an exhale, like a breath she had been holding far too long, finally released. Outside, the fog continues drifting through the street. Inside, the flicker of a candle casts soft shadows on the walls, revealing peeling wallpaper worn furniture, and 2 or 3 children asleep under a blanket too thin for the winter. This practice, giving children soothing syrups or calming candies, was not rare or frowned upon in Victorian society. It was woven into everyday life. Sweet shops sold these remedies in pretty jars, nestled right beside mint drops and sugar sticks. Apothecaries prepared bottles of soothing mixtures, each claiming to quiet restless little ones. Families kept these remedies next to cough drops, fabric starch, and tooth powders, just another part of the household survival kit. To modern eyes, it may feel unimaginable, but in the context of their world, it made more sense than it does now. Medical knowledge was limited. Doctors were expensive. Scientific research was still learning about children's needs. Families did not have access to modern comfort, guidance, or safety standards. They had only each other, their instincts, and the remedies their communities trusted. And it was not just the homes that shaped this habit. The children themselves lived very different lives. Many worked from young ages helping in shops, cleaning floors, carrying goods, or assisting with tasks in factories. Their sleep was irregular, their bodies often tired, their days long. A night of calm felt like a blessing, not just for the parents, but for the children who needed rest to withstand their daily lives. This is not a story about right or wrong. It is a story about a time when families were stretched thin, when every small decision carried weight, and when quieting a restless child might mean the difference between coping and collapsing. The remedies they used existed in a context of poverty, cold nights, thin walls, shared beds, long working hours, and constant uncertainty. From our modern perspective, we see the risks clearly. But for the families living in those cramped rooms, with chores piling up and rent looming, the choice was not philosophical, it was practical. It was survival. And that is why, when we step into this world gently and without judgment, we find ourselves understanding rather than condemning. The Victorian parents who gave their children calming syrups were not careless or unloving. They were doing the best they could with the knowledge, tools, and pressures they had. They were not trying to silence their children forever. They were trying to find a few hours of quiet in a life overflowing with noise, hardship, and work. They were trying to soothe little bodies in rooms too cold for comfort. They were trying to preserve their strength so they could face another day. And beneath everything they did, beneath every remedy offered, every lullaby hummed in the dim candlelight, was something deeply familiar, something timeless, the wish for peace. No matter the century, no matter the place, parents have always searched for ways to comfort their children, to calm the chaos of the day, to create small pockets of warmth in worlds often unkind. The Victorian mother sitting at the edge of the bed, gently feeding her child a sweetened remedy, wanted the same thing any parent today wants. A moment of quiet, a moment where love feels enough to hold a family together, a moment where nothing hurts and everything feels manageable. As we continue our journey into this era, let us carry that understanding with us. Let us see the past not as something distant and strange, but as a mirror reflecting a truth. We all know that people everywhere, in every time, have simply tried to make life a little easier for the ones they love. And tonight, as we walk through fog-covered streets and step softly into dimly lit rooms of another century, we will uncover not only what these families did, but why they felt it was their best option, and what it reveals about the world they lived in. With that in mind, let us keep moving gently through the story. When we step deeper into this Victorian world, one question begins to hover quietly above everything else. Why were soothing syrups and calming candies so widely trusted and used? To us today, They might seem unsettling, but in the 19th century they blended almost seamlessly into the fabric of everyday life. The answer lies not in a single cause, but in a woven tapestry of circumstances: poverty, exhaustion, limited medical understanding, social pressure, and the relentless demands placed upon parents who already lived at the edge of their endurance. To understand this more fully, imagine walking into a typical Victorian home as evening settles in. The warmth from the kitchen hearth flickers through the narrow hallway, but it does not travel far. The cold air gathers near the stairwell, drifting down from the drafty upper rooms. A pot of thin soup sits on the stove, stretching what little food the family has until payday. The floors are worn. The wallpaper is peeling in patterns that resemble tiny maps. And through all of this, a mother moves quietly, her attention split between countless tasks. She is stirring the pot while checking on her oldest child's cough. She is folding laundry while shushing the toddler trying to tug at her skirt. She is rinsing clothes in a basin, her hands going numb from cold water, while the baby starts crying again, sharp, restless, and constant. Her life is made of moments stitched tightly together, each one demanding something from her. There is no pause, no softness, no room for rest, unless she can carve it out somehow. In this environment, soothing syrups and sweet calming drops were not seen as questionable. They were seen as kindness, a small act of mercy for the child, and a lifeline for the parent. They promised rest, where rest was rare. They offered relief, where relief was almost unknown. To the Victorian parent, especially in working-class neighborhoods, the household was not a place of leisure. It was a small, fragile system, held together by discipline and endless labor. The father might work long shifts in a factory or at the docks. The older children might sweep floors, deliver goods, or sew for hours to supplement the family's income. The mother, often without help, managed everything else: cleaning, mending, cooking, caring for children, and sometimes taking in extra work to keep the household afloat. The crying of a single infant could ripple through this already strained system. A sleepless night did not just mean exhaustion. It meant mistakes, missed wages, and potentially losing work opportunities. When the home faltered, even slightly, the consequences could be severe: unpaid rent, empty cupboards, or illness that the family could not afford to treat. So when a mother reached for a syrup or sweet that promised quiet, it was not because she lacked love or care. It was because life allowed her so few options. Medical knowledge was limited, and health care was often inaccessible. Doctors were expensive, and visiting them could cost more than a week's wages. Even if a family could afford a consultation, the treatments of the era were unpredictable, unregulated, and often equally risky. So people usually turned to what was familiar: the advice of neighbors, the remedies recommended by shopkeepers, or the products featured in newspapers with soothing, reassuring language. These syrups were marketed as miracles wrapped in sweetness. Advertisements described them as the perfect solution for teething pains, restless nights, tantrums, growing aches, or even coughs brought on by cold, damp air. They were beautifully packaged, with poetic names like comfort drops, infant's quietness, or evening rest mixture. The labels emphasized relief, comfort, calm, and ease, exactly what parents longed for in a life filled with difficulty. And there was something else at play beneath the surface: trust. Trust in tradition. Trust in familiarity. Trust in routine. When one mother used a remedy and told her, "Neighbor, It helped her child sleep soundly. That endorsement carried more weight than any scientific claim. News spread by word of mouth, from one kitchen to another, until entire communities accepted these products as part of normal childcare. Sweet shops made it even easier by selling the remedies in candy-like forms. A tiny lozenge offered quietly to a fussy child could restore peace long enough for the family to finish their chores or gather the strength needed for the next day. For a society with few choices, these calming candies became woven into tradition. But there was also a deeper emotional layer. Victorian parents were not unaware of their children's suffering. Quite the opposite. They saw it constantly. Children often worked in conditions that would horrify us today. They climbed into narrow chimneys, inhaled dust on factory floors, or spent hours outdoors in cold weather selling goods. Their bodies were tired. Their immune systems were stressed. Their sleep was often interrupted by noise, cold air, or discomfort. These remedies became a way for parents to offer their children something close to comfort in a world that offered so little of it. Giving a restless child a spoon of syrup or a sweet drop was, in the parents' eyes, an act of kindness. A way to help them rest. A momentary shield from the world's hardships. And it is important to remember that in the cultural context of the time, childhood was not seen as a delicate stage requiring gentle protection. It was viewed as a preparation for adulthood, a period of learning, discipline, and endurance. Children were expected to be resilient, obedient, and adaptable to the realities of family life. In that mindset, giving a child something to help them sleep or calm down was not considered harmful. It was considered responsible, a tool to maintain order in a home that could easily descend into chaos if even one part fell out of balance. In the dim rooms of narrow houses, where multiple families sometimes shared a single building, where noise and illness spread quickly, where private space barely existed, calmness was not just a desire, it was a necessity. The family that managed to keep their nights quiet had a better chance of surviving their days. And so, soothing syrups and candies became part of the household vocabulary. A mother might whisper to her friend, "This one helped my youngest sleep last night." A shopkeeper might suggest a lozenge for the nerves of little ones. An advertisement might promise peace for mothers as much as comfort for children. These promises resonated deeply in a society balancing precariously between survival and collapse. All of this shaped the widespread acceptance of these remedies, not because people were careless, but because they lived in conditions that demanded quick solutions to problems modern families solve with much more support. And when you return to that room in your mind, the small one, with peeling wallpaper, a flickering candle, and a mother weighing every decision on the fragile scales of survival, you start to see why these syrups and sweets felt like blessings, not threats. They offered something rare in the Victorian world: control, a moment of quiet, a breath, a break from the relentless pace of life. And above all, they offered reassurance to parents who loved their children deeply but had so few ways to shield them from the hardships of their era. This, more than anything, explains why these remedies became so common. They were born from exhaustion, necessity, trust, fear, and love, all blending together in the dim corners of Victorian homes. And now that we understand this emotional and social landscape, we can move forward gently into the next layer of the story. One where the world of sweet shops, syrups, and household remedies reveals even more about how families lived, coped, and tried to protect the ones they loved in a time when life gave them so few tools to work with. If you want to understand why Victorian parents clung so tightly to soothing syrups and calming candies, you need to step into the daily life of the Victorian child, A life shaped not around play, softness, or discovery, but around necessity, duty, and survival. For children in the 19th century, childhood was not a sanctuary. It was a training ground, a proving ground, and in many cases, a workplace. To see their world clearly, imagine waking up as a Victorian child on an ordinary weekday morning. The light outside is pale and slow, filtered through fog and coal dust drifting between rooftops. The room is cold, so cold that your breath rises in small clouds the moment you exhale. Your mattress is made of straw, thinned out in places where it has sagged under your small weight. The blanket covering you scratches your skin and smells faintly of smoke. There is no moment of gentle waking, no soft glow from a bedside lamp, no time to stretch or linger. The day begins abruptly, often with a voice calling you to get up, because there is simply too much work to do for anyone to lie in bed for long. If your family is poor, as most families are, you may already have a small job, even though you are only 8 or 7 or even 5 years old. And even if you do not work outside the home yet, you still have chores, waiting, fetching water, helping prepare food, minding younger siblings, cleaning, sweeping, mending, and running errands through busy streets. You dress quickly, pulling on clothes that do not quite fit, patched so many times they barely resemble their original fabric. You splash cold water on your face to wake up. Soap is precious, so you use it sparingly. And then you head downstairs where the kitchen is dim, the air thick with last night's fire. Breakfast is simple, often nothing more than bread, perhaps slightly stale, maybe dipped in weak tea if your family can afford it. There are no sweet cereals, no fruits arranged neatly, no warm porridge, unless it is a special day. You eat quietly, because Victorian homes are small, and sound carries. The walls are thin, and privacy is a luxury most families do not know. After breakfast, if you are of working age, you leave the house. And working age, in Victorian terms, simply means old enough to walk without holding someone's hand. Children have jobs because every coin matters. Every coin is survival. Some children sweep chimneys. They climb into dark, narrow spaces where soot fills their lungs and scratches their skin. Others work in factories, pressing cloth, spinning thread, or carrying coal. Some work long hours in match factories, their fingers stained from the chemicals. Others sell goods in the street flowers, matches, newspapers, or trinkets, shouting above the noise of horses and carts. These are not jobs suited to small bodies, but the Victorian world does not bend for childhood. It expects children to bend to it. And when children are home, they do not rest. They help. They clean. They watch siblings. They carry loads. They listen for instructions. They do their best not to create extra noise or fuss. Because noise, especially loud crying, disrupts everything. In a modern home, a crying child might be met with comfort, soothing words, or a moment of patience. But in a Victorian home, a crying child represents something heavier. It means the baby cannot sleep. It means the mother cannot finish her chores. It means the father returning from work will not find a quiet house. It means neighbors might complain. And above all, it means that someone in the family, usually the mother, will have to find a way to calm the child, even if that requires setting aside work that absolutely must get done. This is why quietness becomes not just a preference, but a necessity. A quiet child allows the household to function, allows adults to work, allows siblings to focus on their tasks, allows the fragile balance of survival to hold. And children know this intuitively. Even the smallest toddler understands that too much crying might bring frustrated voices, tired sighs, or the stern hush that fills the room with tension. Because families live so close together, sometimes several in a single building, everyone shares the burden of noise. Babies share beds with siblings. Brothers and sisters share mattresses. Families sleep in the same room. When one child wakes, the whole family wakes. A single restless infant means a night lost for everyone. And a night lost could mean mistakes at work the next day, mistakes that might cost wages or even employment. So Victorian children learn early to be quiet, to endure, to adapt. They grow up faster because life gives them no alternative. Their days are filled with responsibilities that leave no room for softness. And here is where the connection to soothing syrups becomes unmistakable. Imagine being a Victorian mother, watching your child's face grow pale from exhaustion after a long day in the streets. Imagine hearing a baby cry through the thin walls of your shared home, knowing your husband needs sleep for his shift at the docks. Imagine juggling infants, toddlers, laundry, meal preparation, and the constant threat of falling behind. Quietness is not indulgence, it is survival. Calmness is not luxury, it is the difference between coping and collapse. So when the apothecary offers a syrup that can help a teething child find sleep, or a candy that can ease the restlessness of a toddler, Victorian parents do not hesitate. These remedies offer not just comfort for the child, but stability for the entire household. And Victorian children, living under endless pressure, rarely resist. They are used to following rules, used to silence, used to working through discomfort. Many children do not even realize their world is unusual. It is simply the world they are born into. But beneath their resilience, there is tenderness. You will find it in the way siblings protect one another on the streets, in the way older children share scraps of bread with their younger brothers and sisters, in the way they laugh despite the soot, find small joys in simple things, invent games with sticks and stones, or chase each other down the alleys when work is done. Childhood still glimmers here even in hard times. But it is fragile, it is brief, and it is often overshadowed by the weight of responsibility, which makes the soothing syrups and candies feel, at times, like tiny blessing sweetness in a life that rarely offers it. They make bedtime easier. They ease aches that children cannot describe. They give weary families a chance to breathe. They create moments of quiet where joy can grow, even if only for a little while. And so, when you step into the world of Victorian children, you begin to understand why these remedies were woven so deeply into their lives. Not because no one cared, but because everyone cared so much and had so few tools to help. And now that we have seen how children lived and how quietness shaped the rhythms of their homes, it is time to walk even further into the next chapter, into the places where those syrups and candies were made, sold, and trusted with remarkable innocence. Victorian parenting did not revolve around a toolbox of proven, safe remedies. It revolved around what was available, affordable, and endorsed by the voices people considered trustworthy. And in the 19th century, those voices belonged not to pediatricians because pediatrics did not exist yet, but to apothecaries, advertisements, midwives, and neighbors who swore that a certain syrup worked wonders for their endlessly crying infants. From that blend of hope, exhaustion, and limited knowledge emerged some of the most widely used children's remedies in history, tonics and syrups that promised calm, quiet nights, and relief for babies who cried from teething, fevers, hunger, or simply the harshness of Victorian life. These mixtures became household staples, tucked into cabinets, carried in aprons, or kept on bedside tables as naturally as soap or matches. Among them, a few stood out, gaining fame across Britain and North America: Winslow's soothing syrup, Godfrey's cordial, and a variety of other infant quietners that sounded harmless but were anything but. The names were gentle. The ingredients were powerful. And understanding why they were so trusted requires stepping inside the mind of a Victorian parent who saw these remedies not as risks but as lifelines. To start with the most iconic, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. The name alone evokes comfort, soft, maternal, reassuring. It sounded like something created lovingly by a kind nurse who knew babies better than anyone. And that was part of its brilliance. The marketing was not just selling medicine, it was selling trust, warmth, and safety. The syrup was introduced in the 1,840 seconds and quickly found its way into nearly every household with children. Its formula, sweetened with molasses and flavored gently, masked the fact that it contained morphine strong enough to ease pain, stop crying, and push infants into deep sleep. For Victorian mothers, this was not alarming. It was miraculous. They did not see the chemistry, they saw the result. They saw their babies finally rest after hours of screaming from swollen gums. They saw their toddlers calm down after long days in cramped, noisy homes. They saw peace returning to houses, constantly vibrating with chores, labor, and fatigue. Many of these women had 5, 7, even 10 children. A single bottle of syrup meant predictability. It meant they could cook safely without a fussy infant in one arm. It meant older children could concentrate on chores. It meant the family could function. And newspapers reinforced that trust daily. Advertisements printed in bold, confident letters praised the syrup for its soothing effect, pleasant taste, and remarkable reliability. There were testimonials from grateful mothers, midwives, even shopkeepers. Some ads went so far as to say the syrup made children cheerful, rested, or well-behaved, framing the product not just as medicine but as a guarantee of a harmonious home. That is how powerful the calm messaging was. It transformed a narcotic into a symbol of good parenting. Then there was Godfrey's cordial, another remedy used widely among working-class families. Sweet, thick, and easily mixed into food or milk, it contained opium alongside sugary ingredients that made it easy for even the youngest infants to swallow. Godfrey's cordial had existed since the 1700s, and by the Victorian era, it was considered almost old-fashioned, its familiarity making it feel even safer. Generations had used it, and the continuity alone was proof enough for families who relied on tradition when formal medical knowledge was scarce. The cordial was cheap, available in general shops, and handed out without judgment. Shopkeepers sold it with casual confidence, sometimes even recommending it based on how loudly your baby cried. In communities where every mother was exhausted, Godfrey's became a silent partner in childcare, unquestioned, trusted, and woven into routines. Midwives, too, praised it, sometimes using it to keep infants quiet during long labor nights or while tending to several families at once. When the voices closest to you, neighbors, midwives, older relatives, swore by something, you believed them. It was not blind faith. It was shared experience. Other remedies also filled the shelves. Infant's quietness, Dalby's carminative, paregoric elixirs, and countless locally brewed mixtures with handwritten labels. Many combined alcohol, opium, herbs, and sweeteners. Some promised to fix colic. Others claimed to soothe excessive fretfulness, night terrors, or overactive nerves, terms that could mean anything from teething to simple childhood frustration. And the packaging mattered. Bottles were decorated with elegant lettering, delicate scroll work, and language designed to reassure. Words like comfort, soothing, pleasant, and restful filled every inch of the label. Parents saw kindness where modern science sees danger. The contrast is striking. A bottle that looks like a gift becomes, with hindsight, a risk disguised as sweetness. But the Victorian parent did not have hindsight. They had survival to think about. Another reason these remedies became so accepted was the structure of Victorian medicine itself. Doctors were expensive. Many families could not afford regular visits, especially laborers, factory workers, and families with many children. Apothecaries were more accessible, but their training varied wildly. Some were skilled, but many learned their trade through apprenticeships that focused more on mixing and selling than understanding the human body. Soothing syrups filled the gap left by unreliable healthcare systems. They were consistent where doctors were not. They were cheap where consultations were not. They were available at all hours, in all towns, in all seasons. Mothers did not need to understand the pharmacology. They needed something that worked, and quickly. And when something works reliably, even if it is dangerous, it becomes trusted. There was also another factor: the cultural belief that silence equaled health. Victorians valued stillness and composure. Children who fussed, cried, or demanded attention were seen as at risk of future misbehavior. A quiet child was a well-raised child. A calm child reflected positively on the household. A silent child created harmony. And these syrups delivered that silence perfectly. In a time when families shared small rooms, when neighbors were quick to complain, and when fathers returned home exhausted from long, physically draining workdays, the pressure to maintain a quiet household was immense. Soothing syrups became a tool not just for parenting, but for preserving social respectability. The final element in their widespread trust was simply the lack of alternatives. There were no teething toys, cooling gels, pediatric pain relievers, or safe calming techniques. If a baby cried from hunger, cold, teething, overstimulation, or the countless discomforts of Victorian life, there were few ways to help. And so, these remedies, sweet, convenient, seemingly gentle, stepped in to fill every space where modern resources did not yet exist. But behind the trust lay a darker truth. The effects were powerful. Too powerful. Parents loved these syrups not because they understood them, but because they worked. And in a world where survival required constant effort, that was enough. They did not see addiction forming. They did not see slowed breathing as a warning sign. They did not connect long naps with potential danger. They simply saw peace, the brief, golden quiet that made Victorian life feel manageable. And for that, these remedies became faithful companions in countless homes, standing silently on shelves, offering comfort that Victorian society simply did not know how to provide in any other way. One of the quiet, haunting truths of the Victorian era is that even when parents wanted to do the right thing, there was almost no reliable guidance to help them understand what the right thing actually was. When a mother reached for a soothing syrup, she did not find a clear label listing ingredients, warnings, proper dosage, or safety notes. Instead, she found instructions written in soft, vague language phrases like a small spoonful, as needed, or given when the child is fretful, leaving her to interpret the meaning in the context of her own exhaustion and desperation. And because Victorian households rarely had clocks let alone measurement tools. As needed could mean anything from every few hours to whenever the crying became too overwhelming to bear. This uncertainty was not an accident. It reflected a world without standardized measurements, without medical oversight, and without the safety practices we take for granted today. The Victorian parent was not careless. They were operating inside a system that simply did not offer clarity. Imagine, for a moment, a mother standing in her dim kitchen, holding a spoon and staring at a bottle whose label is decorated with swirls, elegant lettering, and promises of rest. The candle next to her flickers, smoke curling upward as she tries to interpret the instructions. A teaspoon might mean a literal spoon from her old kitchen drawer, a spoon that is larger than modern teaspoons, perhaps deeper, perhaps flatter. A few drops might be poured without precision, because a dropper as we know it today did not exist. Even the idea of measuring by milligrams or standardized volume would have felt foreign to her. She pours carefully, guessing, hoping she is not giving too much, praying she is not giving too little. The baby cries louder, calling her attention away from caution toward action. She tips the spoon gently into the infant's mouth. The crying softens. The child drifts into calmness, and she breathes again. In that moment, it does not feel like a medical procedure. It feels like relief. But behind that simple act lies a mountain of unknowns, unknowns no Victorian parent could have possibly unraveled. For one, the remedies varied wildly from one bottle to another. An apothecary in Manchester might mix a syrup stronger than the one made by a chemist in London. A traveling vendor might water his mixture down to save money, or thicken it with more sugar to make it taste better. There was no regulation, no quality control, no inspections. Two bottles with identical labels could behave completely differently once swallowed by a child. Families did not realize this, because the world around them normalized inconsistency. They bought flour that sometimes had husks in it. They bought milk that spoiled too quickly. They bought cloth dyed unevenly. They lived with uncertainty in every part of life, so the inconsistency of medicine did not stand out as unusual. If a syrup worked once and seemed to work again, that was enough. If a candy helped quiet a teething toddler last week, the mother reached for it again this week without hesitation. Consistency was not expected. Results were. And then there was the problem of trusting appearances. Victorian remedies were wrapped in the language of care. Bottles looked elegant. Advertisements used words like safe, gentle, recommended, and beloved by mothers. There were no regulations requiring companies to prove these claims. They could print any promise they wanted, so they did. A remedy might be described as perfectly harmless, even if it carried risks modern medicine would classify as severe. Parents believed these words, not because they were naive, but because they had no reason not to. The government had not yet established standards for medicine. Scientific literacy was limited, and many of the dangers of these ingredients simply were not known yet. The Victorian era had no public health campaigns explaining risks, no medical leaflets warning families about overuse, no research papers documenting long-term effects. In that absence of information, families filled the gaps with trust. Compounding the problem was the fact that Victorian society was only beginning to understand the human body. Pain was treated as something that needed to be silenced quickly, not a symptom that needed deeper examination. Sleep was seen as unquestionably beneficial, no matter how it was achieved. A baby who slept for long stretches was considered healthy, easy, or good, even if the cause of that sleep was a powerful calming agent. Long naps were not suspicious. They were blessings. If a child was unusually calm, Parents interpreted it as a sign that the remedy was working beautifully, unaware that sedation could mask deeper issues. This belief was reinforced by neighbors, friends, and even midwives who had grown up with the same assumptions. Another layer of the problem was the lack of education. Many Victorian women had limited access to formal schooling, especially in working-class areas. They learned by watching their mothers, their aunts, their neighbors. If previous generations used these remedies, it felt natural to continue. Knowledge passed through stories, not textbooks. A mother might hear, "My mother gave this to all of us, and we grew up fine." Or the baker's wife swears by this mixture, and that was enough credibility to trust it. It was not ignorance. It was inherited tradition, operating in a world that offered no better alternative. The most striking thing, though, was that Victorian parents had no framework for understanding the concept of dosage at all. Precise measurement was not part of everyday life. Recipes used handfuls, pinches, and guesses. Household tools varied widely. Even the size of spoons differed from home to home. And because children differed so much in age, size, and health, something that soothed one child might be too strong for another. Without standardized instructions, mothers did what they always did. They relied on intuition, trial, and error, not realizing that medicine was far less forgiving than cooking. The lack of warning signs compounded this further. When a baby became sleepy, parents felt relieved. When a toddler became quiet, they believed the remedy was doing exactly what it promised. Because these mixtures acted slowly, gently at first, their dangers were subtle, hidden beneath the very calmness that parents found so comforting. A Victorian mother would notice if her child seemed peaceful. She would not think to question it. And Victorian society reinforced this by praising quiet babies as the ideal. The quieter a child was, the more skillful the parent appeared. This cultural value made calming remedies not just practical, but socially desirable. They were not merely tools. They were symbols of successful household management. Even doctors, those who should have known better, sometimes recommended these remedies without fully understanding their effects. Medical training was inconsistent, and many physicians believed that soothing a child's discomfort was more important than identifying the root cause. To them, a remedy that brought relief was good, even if its long-term consequences were unclear. And because doctors often echoed what advertisements claimed, parents assumed these products were medically endorsed. The truth is that Victorian parents were not making dangerous choices. They were making the only choices they felt they had. They operated without information, without warnings, without scientific context, and without safe alternatives. Their world gave them responsibility but not knowledge, hope but not tools. And in that gap, soothing syrups flourished unchecked. When we look back now, with modern understanding and scientific clarity, it is easy to see the risks. But when we place ourselves in the dim kitchens and cramped bedrooms of the 19th century, we see people doing their best with the limited guidance they had. They were not neglectful. They were not careless. They were human tired, overwhelmed, and desperately trying to find what little comfort they could for their children and themselves. To understand why Victorian families leaned so heavily on soothing syrups and calming candies, you have to imagine exhaustion not as a momentary feeling, but as a constant companion, a shadow following every step, settling into the muscles, the bones, the rhythms of daily life. In the modern world, exhaustion is something we try to recover from. In the Victorian world, exhaustion was something people lived inside, like a second skin. And nowhere was this more true than in families, where every member, including children, carried burdens far heavier than their small bodies were built for. Picture a typical working-class home, its walls thin, its floors worn, its ceilings low and darkened by years of smoke. Everything is cramped: the kitchen, the bedroom, the hallway, the shared beds, the air itself. Parents rise before dawn because their work demands an early start. A father might spend his day hauling sacks at the docks, breathing in dust from warehouses. A mother might spend 16 hours cleaning other people's homes, scrubbing steps, washing clothes, or piecing together sewing work late into the night for coins so small they disappear between the fingers. And then there are the children. Their days begin before the sun has fully lifted the fog. Some work in mills, tending spinning machines that roar endlessly. Some sweep chimneys, climbing into narrow spaces where their knees scrape brick walls. Others deliver goods in the cold, shouting through the streets while dodging horses and carriages. Many simply help keep the household running, babysitting younger siblings, running errands in the damp morning air, carrying water from pumps blocks away, or helping their mothers with endless domestic tasks. The exhaustion is not occasional. It is the foundation of daily life. So when a child cries at night, it is not just noise. It is the unraveling of everything the family has struggled to hold together. A sleepless night for a Victorian family is not a minor inconvenience. It is a threat. If the father arrives late to work or makes a mistake because he is tired, he could lose his position. If the mother can't complete her laundry or sewing on time, the family loses income. If the older children can't concentrate or stay awake at their jobs, they could be dismissed. In an era with no financial safety net, every lost day of work is a disaster. That is why quietness becomes essential, not for comfort, but for survival. A mother listening to her baby cry in the middle of the night is not just hearing fussiness, she is hearing the sound of tomorrow slipping out of her grasp. She is hearing the possibility of lost wages, harsh consequences, or the judgment of neighbors in tightly packed housing where every sound echoes through the walls. The pressure is immense, unrelenting, and woven into every decision she makes. In this world, the calming syrups and candies seem less like dangerous substances and more like gifts, tiny, sweet miracles in glass bottles. They offer a promise. The baby will sleep, the toddler will settle, and the household will hold together long enough to survive another day. And because children also lived exhausting lives, these remedies felt even more justifiable. A child who labored for 10 hours, whose feet ached, whose lungs burned from dust or cold air, might come home overtired, overstimulated, crying from discomfort they could not articulate. A mother watching this unfold could see the syrup as a kindness, a way to give her child rest in a world that rarely allowed it. There is also the emotional exhaustion layered beneath the physical one. Imagine 8 or 9 people living in 2 rooms, each sound amplified, each moment of stress shared by everyone. Arguments break out easily. Whispered frustrations grow louder. The simple act of trying to cook dinner becomes complicated by crying children tugging at sleeves. Without quiet, the household becomes a fragile machine rattling toward collapse. Soothing syrups help hold that machine together. And because every mother, every neighbor, every woman living in similar circumstances is using the same remedies, the sense of trust becomes communal. It feels almost like participating in a shared ritual, the normalization of a practice that today would feel dangerous, but then felt profoundly logical. Even the fathers played a role in this mindset. After 10 or 12 hours of manual labor, they returned home exhausted, needing rest before the cycle began again. A quiet household was not just pleasant, it was necessary for their ability to keep their jobs. A crying infant was not merely a family issue, it was a threat to their livelihood. In that context, A syrup that quieted the child was not just helpful, it was indispensable. Life in the Victorian era also came with a heavy emotional toll. Families experienced loss frequently. Illness was common. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly high. Against such a backdrop, these syrups and candies often provided psychological relief as well. If a child was fussy or sick, parents had few ways to ease their suffering. Hospitals were far away. Doctors were expensive. Home remedies were unpredictable. A syrup that calmed the child felt like a small act of mercy in a world with few mercies to offer. Some mothers even believed these remedies protected their children. A baby who slept peacefully was thought to be healthier, growing stronger, or overcoming discomfort. Quietness equaled wellness. Stillness equaled recovery. In a society where knowledge of the body was limited, where signs of illness were misunderstood, and where rest was equated with healing, these syrups reinforced the illusion of care. And we must not underestimate the psychological exhaustion of parenting multiple children in such conditions. Victorian families were large, often with 6, 7, or more children. Juggling their needs with limited resources, limited space, and limited support was overwhelming. Modern families talk about parent burnout, but Victorian parents lived inside a constant version of it. Calmness was not a luxury. It was the only way to maintain sanity. So when soothing remedies worked, and they did work, powerfully parents saw them not as shortcuts, but as allies. Bottles became part of bedtime routines. Candies became part of teething rituals. A mother might keep a bottle in her apron pocket, reaching for it instinctively when the day became too heavy. And even when parents sensed something was not entirely right, maybe the child slept too deeply, or too long, or seemed unusually quiet, they often pushed aside the thought. What alternative did they have? Without knowledge, without tools, without support, they relied on what worked, even if it worked too well. That is the heart of this era's story. People were not irresponsible. They were overwhelmed. They were not indifferent. They were desperate. They were not choosing danger. They were choosing the only comfort they had in a world where their children faced far harsher risks each day. Victorian life was not gentle, and neither were its expectations. Families survived by holding on to whatever scraps of peace they could find, even if those scraps came bottled in small glass jars with soft-sounding names. If you stand inside a Victorian home long enough, listening to the soft hush of a mother soothing her child, watching the flicker of a candle illuminate shelves lined with bottles whose labels promise calm, you begin to understand something subtle but powerful. No one in this world truly understands what these remedies contain. Not the mothers who administer them. Not the fathers who bring them home. Not the neighbors who recommend them. Not even, in many cases, the shopkeepers who sell them. The knowledge simply does not exist. Or if it does, it exists only in fragments, hidden within the small circles of early medical researchers whose findings rarely travel beyond academic walls. There is no shared public understanding. There are no warnings passed down through generations. There is no moment when a parent says, "Be careful, this could be dangerous." Instead, there is a quiet, collective unawareness, almost like a fog settling over the entire population, shaping decisions without anyone realizing it. Part of the reason is the state of science itself. In the Victorian era, medicine is still closer to an art than a structured discipline. Modern concepts like controlled studies, long-term research, or standardized testing simply have not developed yet. The idea that a substance could create dependency is not widely understood, even among doctors. Many physicians still use the same calming agents in their own treatments, administering them to adults for everything from coughs to sleeplessness. They know these substances, quiet discomfort, slow breathing, and bring warmth and calmness to the body. They do not yet fully grasp how the brain adapts to repeated use, how tolerance develops, or how subtle physiological changes accumulate. Without this scientific foundation, it is impossible for the public to know the risks. Imagine a Victorian mother noticing that her baby sleeps more deeply after each spoonful of syrup, sometimes so deeply she must hold her breath to listen for the rise and fall of the child's tiny chest. Does she interpret this as danger? No. She interprets it as relief, as rest, as healing. The very signs we now recognize as red flags, excessive sleepiness, slowed breathing, lethargy, were then misread as positive outcomes. They were signs the remedy was working. That is why, when children slept for hours, mothers felt grateful instead of concerned. They believed their child's tiny body was fighting off discomfort or growing strong through rest. They did not imagine the syrup could be too strong or too frequent. In a world where children worked long hours, played in unsafe streets, inhaled coal dust, and suffered illnesses with little treatment, sleep seemed like the purest gift. Another layer of ignorance came from the appearance of the remedies themselves. They were sweet, pleasant, and comforting to taste. Mothers often tasted the syrups first, just as they did with food. And because the syrups tasted like molasses, or honey, or mint, they felt harmless. Danger, in their minds, tasted bitter or medicinal. Sweetness meant safety. So when these syrups slid softly over the tongue, offering no burn, bitterness, or sign of harshness, mothers saw them as gentle helpers rather than powerful substances. Many of these remedies were mixed with alcohol or sugar precisely to mask the strength of their ingredients. No one suspected that something so sweet could hold such power. Marketing deepened this innocence. Advertisements were poetic, almost tender, filled with language designed to reassure. Soothing, comforting, kind to infants, restoring, gentle as a mother's touch. These were not just products, they were emotional anchors. When a parent saw comforting words in print, they did not question them. Why would they? Literacy was rising, and printed words were treated with respect, almost authority. People believed what they read. And because the advertisements were everywhere on walls, in newspapers, in shop windows, their message felt universal. Everyone is using these. Everyone trusts these. Everyone says they work. How could something so widely accepted be dangerous? Then there was the silence, the enormous silence created by families who did not connect cause and effect. When a child grew weaker over time, families often attributed it to malnutrition, overwork, long winters, or the countless illnesses that floated through overcrowded cities. Children were fragile in the Victorian world, and many families simply assumed that fragile health was normal. The idea that a soothing syrup could contribute to long-term weakness never crossed their minds. Why would it? The effects were subtle, cumulative, hidden beneath layers of poverty, cold, and exhaustion. A child who seemed pale or lethargic might simply be labeled delicate. A baby who slept excessively was considered easy. A toddler who struggled to wake in the mornings might be described as dreamy or quiet by nature. And when tragedies did occur, when an infant did not wake from a nap, families and physicians often misattributed the cause. Illness was everywhere. Fevers, respiratory infections, malnutrition, contaminated water. These were the explanations people reached for. Not because they were blind, but because they had no framework to understand the danger in their own cupboard. The idea that the syrup itself could pose a risk was simply inconceivable to most Victorian families. Even physicians, when called to attend to such tragedies, often lacked the knowledge or tools to identify the true cause. Medical examinations were rudimentary. Autopsies were rare and often imprecise. Without detailed understanding of bodily chemistry, even well-meaning doctors misdiagnosed the cause of death. A child who passed away might be said to have succumbed to failure of the constitution, a vague term that reflected exhaustion, illness, or weakness. No one looked to the syrup. This widespread unawareness was not driven by carelessness. It was driven by context. The Victorian family simply did not have access to the information we now take for granted. There were no health campaigns, no pamphlets, no books warning parents, no government agencies testing safety, no standardized labels, no requirement to disclose ingredients, no pediatric specialists, no investigative journalism uncovering risks. Knowledge traveled slowly and inconsistently, often trapped in academic circles or overshadowed by the louder voices of advertisers and commercial success. When families finally heard whispers of danger, they dismissed them easily. Rumors traveled through neighborhoods, but without evidence, they were quickly drowned out by the testimonies of other mothers whose children had calmed and slept after taking the syrup. And because most families lived in survival mode, they did not have the luxury to examine long-term risks. They needed immediate solutions. They needed quiet tonight. They needed rest now. In a way, the Victorian world conditioned parents to focus only on the present. The future was uncertain, health was unpredictable, and life was difficult. So they trusted what seemed to help in the moment. And until reformers, journalists, and scientists slowly began to raise alarm bells, the population continued to use these remedies with confidence, affection, and even gratitude. But the truth is poignant. Victorian parents were not negligent. They were not choosing danger. They were not ignoring warnings. They simply lived in a world where the concept of risk looked different than it does today. They acted with love, with hope, with trust, all while navigating a world where the harshest hazards were often invisible. To truly understand the Victorian relationship with these soothing syrups and calming candies, we have to walk into one of the heaviest but most essential truths of the era. Victorian childhood was always lived in the shadow of loss. Even the happiest families carried quiet grief behind their doors. Nearly every household had experienced the passing of an infant, a toddler, or a small child. It was sorrow woven into society's fabric, not spoken loudly, but present in every choice parents made, shaping their fears, hopes, and decisions in ways that are difficult to imagine today. Imagine a mother sitting on the edge of a narrow bed, her hands folded in her lap, watching her baby breathe. She does not assume the child will live to adulthood. No one in her generation does. She knows children are fragile. She knows illness comes quickly and often without warning. She knows winter chills slip through walls like ghosts. She knows contaminated water, tainted milk, unclean air, and overworked little bodies all threaten her children daily. She has buried one child already, or she has stood beside a friend who did. And she has seen neighbors wrap tiny bodies in cloth for burial, a sight so common it becomes part of the rhythm of community life. Against this backdrop, calming syrups feel like kindness, not danger. Because when you live in a world where a simple fever can take a child in a single night, the idea that a syrup could be harmful never crosses your mind. Illness is everywhere. Loss is everywhere. The risks parents see are external, not internal. They fear cold winters, polluted streets, contaminated milk, accidents in the workplace, fires, and infectious diseases. The silent risks hiding inside a sweet-tasting syrup are invisible, unimaginable. And so, when a child shows signs of chronic lethargy, slow movements, long naps, heavy eyelids, Victorian parents do not see danger. They see recovery. They see calmness after distress. They see a child who is not crying, not suffering, not keeping the house awake at night. The signs blend seamlessly into the larger landscape of Victorian childhood. A tired child is normal. A pale child is normal. A quiet child is normal. A child who prefers sleep is normal. Victorian families do not read these signs the way modern parents do. They do not see long-term patterns. They do not connect cause and effect. They see only what fits the world they know, a world where children often appear weak because life itself weakens them. Imagine a toddler who sleeps excessively after receiving one of these remedies. The mother strokes the child's hair and whispers to neighbors, "He is finally resting. Poor thing, he was so upset last night." She does not wonder if the remedy was too strong. She wonders if maybe the child was fighting off an illness. Or perhaps he was exhausted from helping fetch water. Or maybe he did not sleep well the night before. The explanations she reaches for are shaped by her reality, not by biochemical knowledge she does not possess. Even when multiple children in the same household show signs of unusual sleepiness, the family interprets it through their shared experiences. It must be the cold weather. They did not eat enough yesterday. The air was bad near the factory. There are so many possible reasons, real, visible reasons, that the hidden one never comes to mind. And because these remedies are used widely, parents see their effects everywhere. If one child in the neighborhood seems unusually quiet after taking a syrup, it does not stand out. Many children are quiet. Many children are pale. Many children sleep deeply. In fact, a child who is energetic, loud, or restless is more likely to draw attention than one who is subdued. The social environment normalizes these symptoms so thoroughly that even when something seems off, it blends back into the pattern of daily life. Infant mortality, so tragically common, creates a veil that covers the consequences of overuse or misuse. A child who passes away unexpectedly is mourned, but the cause is rarely investigated. Most families conclude it was illness, weakness, or perhaps teething fever, a term Victorians used to describe severe reactions they believed were caused by teething. They do not suspect the syrup, and the few who do wonder quietly keep this to themselves, unsure and afraid of appearing to blame themselves. Meanwhile, chronic lethargy, the slow, draining quietness that seeps into a child over weeks or months, is dismissed as personality. "He has always been calm," a mother might say. "She is a dreamy child," another might remark. "He was born delicate," someone else might add. Personality labels mask symptoms that today would be seen as serious warning signs. Even midwives and nurses, whose experience with children is extensive, often misinterpret these signs. A baby who sleeps through the night is praised. A newborn who remains calm during teething is admired. A toddler who rarely cries is considered angelic. No one questions the root cause because no one is looking for one. There is also the issue of trust. When a mother uses a syrup for months without immediate disaster, she becomes more confident in it. The absence of a dramatic consequence convinces her it is safe. If anything, she becomes more likely to use it regularly believing it to be a gentle tool in raising her children. And because the adverse effects are subtle, gradual, and easily attributed to the hardships of Victorian life, the truth remains hidden. This hidden nature is what makes the impact so profound. It is not dramatic events, but quiet changes. A child losing interest in play. A toddler who no longer laughs as freely. A baby whose limbs feel heavier than they should. A pattern of deep, unsettling sleep. The slow dulling of curiosity. The way vitality drains little by little, unnoticed because the family's attention is occupied by survival. These changes happen in a house filled with noise, chores, stress, and constant demands. Parents simply do not have the luxury of observing every detail. They are overwhelmed. They must feed 6 children, wash clothes by hand, cook over an open flame, fetch water from outdoor pumps, and stretch every coin to its limit. In that environment, the small clues dissolve into the background. Even when lethargy becomes more pronounced, families often turn to the same remedy that contributed to it. A child's lack of energy may be interpreted as discomfort or illness, prompting parents to administer more syrup in hopes of offering relief. The remedy becomes both the cause and the attempted solution, creating a quiet, tragic cycle that no one recognizes. And woven through all of this is the emotional reality that Victorian parents carry enormous fear. When illness is common and death unpredictable, a parent's first instinct is always to seek comfort for their child. They do not think in terms of chemical dependence or long-term harm. They think in terms of the moment before them, the crying baby, the restless toddler, the child who seems overwhelmed. Their hearts guide them toward what seems like tenderness. The heartbreaking truth is that the very love that leads parents to soothe their children becomes intertwined with the remedies that undermine the children's strength. Not because parents were careless, but because they were blind to dangers no one had ever explained to them. Victorian society did not warn them. Medicine did not guide them. Science had not yet spoken clearly. And so, the shadow of these remedies stretched quietly across the lives of children unnoticed, unnamed, and woven into the rhythm of survival. For decades, the soothing syrups and calming candies of the Victorian world drifted quietly through households, like a soft mist, comforting, familiar, unquestioned. They sat on shelves beside bread and candles, passed from mother to mother, whispered about in markets and doorways. And for just as long, their risks remained hidden beneath the surface of daily life. But change, even in an era as rigid as the 19th century, has a way of beginning with whispers from a single voice, noticing what others have grown used to. That is how the tide began to turn. Not through sudden revelation, but through small, persistent questions asked by people who refused to accept that childhood frailty and frequent infant loss were simply the way things were. It began with reformers, the ones who walked into overcrowded homes, saw exhausted mothers rocking restless infants, and started to wonder whether the comfort offered by these remedies carried a quieter cost. These reformers were often women themselves, trained in emerging forms of social work or involved in charitable missions that brought them directly into the living rooms and kitchens of working families. They observed patterns others overlooked. They listened to mothers talk about how often they used certain syrups, how deeply their babies slept afterward, how older children seemed unusually quiet, and they began to notice connections that most parents did not have the time, energy, or external perspective to see. One reformer might visit 10 homes in a week and see the same bottle, the same label, the same promises. She might hear mothers praise the syrup for helping babies sleep like angels. She might see toddlers whose eyes drooped heavily during daylight hours. At first, she chalked it up to exhaustion, poverty, hunger. But as the weeks became months, the pattern began to take shape in her mind. The problem was not a single family or a single child. It was something larger. Then there were the journalists, particularly the new wave of investigative writers who emerged as literacy rates rose and newspaper culture expanded. These journalists were often bold, curious, and determined to shine a light on the shadows of society that polite Victorian circles preferred to ignore. Some turned their attention to the unregulated remedies sold in apothecaries and sweet shops. They visited shops across the city, buying bottles of syrups and drops. They brought them to early chemists for analysis, and they were startled by what they found. In many cases, the journalists did not yet have the language to express what they had uncovered. They could not explain the biochemistry. They could not articulate addiction as we understand it today. But they knew enough to raise alarm. They wrote articles with headlines that hinted at danger, urging parents to be cautious. Their reports were not always welcomed. Many readers dismissed them as exaggerations. Others believed the journalists were attacking products that had been household staples for generations. Still, the seeds of awareness were planted. Emerging medical voices added another layer of insight. The Victorian era was a time of profound transformation in medical science. Slow, uneven, but undeniably real. New research institutions were forming. Anatomical knowledge was expanding. Early experiments in chemical analysis were becoming more precise. And with this progress came the realization that certain substances carried effects that extended far beyond mere soothing. A handful of forward-thinking physicians began to speak about it. They noticed that children given soothing syrups regularly failed to gain strength. They noticed that toddlers who consumed calming drops became unusually dependent on them to sleep. They observed that infants who were given these remedies during teething remained sluggish weeks later. Without using modern terminology, they recognized patterns of overuse, dependency, and cumulative harm. But medicine moves slowly, especially in societies where traditions are strong and scientific literacy is low. Medical warnings often competed with advertisements printed on the very next page of the newspaper. A doctor might advise caution, only for a mother to see a bold, comforting ad the next morning, declaring a syrup safe and gentle for all children. Which voice would she trust? The rare physician she could barely afford to visit, or the daily reassurance printed everywhere she looked? Even so, the warnings grew louder over time. Reformers wrote reports for charitable organizations. Journalists published follow-up investigations, comparing remedies from different shops and uncovering wide variations in strength. Early scientists published papers in medical journals outlining concerns that few lay people read, but which influenced the next generation of doctors. It was a slow, uphill battle, like pushing against the weight of an entire culture that had normalized these remedies for decades. Yet progress continued, pushed forward by stories that were difficult to ignore. A child who did not wake from sleep. A toddler who failed to grow stronger despite receiving comforting medicine. Infants whose declining vitality could not be explained by illness alone. These tragedies, whispered from household to household, reached the ears of reformers and investigators. They connected the dots. They spoke as loudly as Victorian society would allow. And as they spoke, something began to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but perceptibly. Mothers started to question whether too much syrup might be too strong. Some reduced how often they used it. Others switched to weaker mixtures. A few stopped using them altogether, choosing instead to rely on homemade remedies like warm cloths, herbal teas, or gentle rocking. Trust, once so deep, began to thin. Still, change was uneven. In wealthier households, mothers had access to doctors who advised moderation. In rural areas, reformers rarely reached families, and old habits persisted. But in the crowded cities, where reformers walked the streets daily, where newspapers circulated widely, where new ideas spread rapidly, the shift was unmistakable. The most powerful effect of these early critics was not that they eliminated the remedies immediately. It was that they introduced doubt. They created a small pause in the minds of parents who had never questioned these products before. They opened a space where awareness could grow slowly, unevenly, but undeniably, and that space mattered. Because once a society begins to question something it has accepted without thought, the path toward reform begins, even if the destination is still far away. The Victorian world was learning, cautiously and painfully, that not everything sweet was safe, not everything trusted was harmless, and not everything that quieted a child was a blessing. It would take decades for regulations to take shape, for public understanding to deepen, and for safer alternatives to emerge. But this moment, this shift, driven by reformers, journalists, and early medical voices, marked the beginning of a long journey toward modern child health care. A journey that began with a few people brave enough to look at what others had grown used to and to say, softly but firmly, something is wrong. Change in the Victorian era rarely arrived as a sudden storm. It arrived the way dawn creeps into a foggy London street, softly, reluctantly, almost as if the world is unsure whether it is ready to wake. And that is how regulation came to the soothing syrups and calming candies that had quietly shaped childhoods for generations. Not through abrupt bans or dramatic announcements, but through a long, slow tightening of awareness, responsibility, and law. To understand why regulation moved so slowly, we have to remember that the Victorian world was not built on systems of oversight. It was built on trust. Trust in shopkeepers, trust in advertisements, trust in tradition. The idea that the government should step in to monitor medicines, ingredients, and dosages was almost radical. Most people believed such matters belonged to households, not officials. Medicine was considered part of private life, personal choice, and community wisdom. So when reformers and journalists began raising questions, many lawmakers hesitated. They were not sure whether it was the government's place to interfere. But the pressure did not fade. It grew slowly, steadily, as more evidence accumulated and more voices spoke up. Early health boards, still in their infancy, began receiving complaints about unregulated remedies. Doctors reported inconsistent effects. Families whispered concerns about children who remained unusually quiet after using certain syrups. Reformers submitted written reports to parliamentary committees, describing what they had seen in overcrowded neighborhoods: toddlers too lethargic to play, infants who slept too deeply, bottles that varied wildly in potency from shop to shop. Lawmakers found themselves confronting a difficult question. Could they continue to treat these products as harmless household items when growing evidence suggested otherwise? The first shifts were small. A few cities introduced local ordinances requiring apothecaries to keep records of what they sold, not to restrict their products simply to observe patterns. This was a cautious step, almost timid, but it marked the beginning of public awareness. Then came early proposals urging manufacturers to disclose ingredients more clearly. These proposals were controversial. Many companies resisted, arguing that their formulas were proprietary secrets. Some claimed that revealing ingredients would undermine their business. Others insisted that the public trusted them already and that transparency was unnecessary. But in the background, science was advancing. Chemistry was maturing into a discipline capable of analyzing substances with increasing precision. Public health boards gained momentum, and newspapers emboldened by investigative journalists continued publishing exposes about the strength and inconsistency of popular remedies. Each article added another crack to the facade of unquestioned trust. The turning point began when doctors themselves became more vocal. As medical understanding improved, physicians started recognizing patterns with more clarity. They noticed that infants who were given certain syrups showed similar symptoms. They compared notes. They published papers. They presented findings at conferences. Their language was still cautious, but the message was clear. The unregulated sale of powerful substances posed a widespread risk. It was no longer possible to dismiss concerns as isolated incidents. Public sentiment began to shift. Middle-class families, always keen to protect their children, became wary of remedies whose ingredients were not listed. Some began requesting alternatives. Others pressed apothecaries for more information. And while working-class families had fewer choices, even they started to question whether the syrups they had relied on for so long were truly harmless. This slow cultural pivot opened the door for larger legislative changes. When lawmakers proposed the first wave of regulations, the public was more prepared to accept them. These laws did not ban the remedies, far from it, but they required apothecaries to label their products more accurately. They demanded transparency. For the first time, manufacturers had to print the ingredients of their products on the bottle. It seems like a small step to us today, but for Victorian families, it was revolutionary. It introduced clarity where there had been only guesswork. Following that, additional laws required apothecaries to obtain licenses. They had to demonstrate a basic understanding of chemistry and medicine before being permitted to sell certain substances. This did not eliminate risks, but it reduced them by ensuring that the people preparing remedies had formal training rather than relying solely on apprenticeship traditions. Then came the Pharmacy Act's slow, cautious steps that gradually tightened the boundaries around what could be sold without oversight. These laws introduced the idea that some substances needed to be monitored, regulated, and controlled. They divided remedies into categories: those that could be sold freely, those that required specific handling, and those that could only be dispensed under professional supervision. For the first time, the soothing syrups, so deeply woven into Victorian parenting, were recognized as belonging to the second or third category. But even with these laws, change in households was gradual. Many families still had old bottles in their cupboards. Many were skeptical of government intrusion, and many were simply too accustomed to the remedies to stop using them immediately. It took a combination of continued public education, new alternatives, and slow generational turnover before usage declined significantly. As the decades passed, regulation expanded. Science became clearer. Doctors became more confident in their warnings, and newspapers shifted from promoting these remedies to criticizing them. Eventually, the soothing syrups that once felt like essential tools of parenting began disappearing from homes. They were replaced by milder products, herbal mixtures, and early forms of pediatric medicine that focused on alleviating specific symptoms rather than quieting children entirely. Society, for the first time, began to understand that children's bodies were delicate, that their systems responded differently to substances, and that the answer to distress was not always to silence it. The Victorian belief that quietness equaled good health slowly dissolved. In its place emerged the idea that children's expressions, even crying, were signals to be understood rather than suppressed. And the final shift came with the recognition that childhood itself deserved protection. New laws emerged regulating child labor. Cities improved sanitation. Public health campaigns taught families about hygiene, nutrition, and early signs of illness. As the understanding of childhood deepened, the sense of responsibility toward children grew. And with it, the old reliance on dangerous remedies faded into history. Looking back, it becomes clear that regulation was not just about controlling substances. It was about reshaping the relationship between parents and the remedies they trusted. It was about building a society where families did not have to choose between their exhaustion and their children's well-being. It was about creating systems strong enough to safeguard the most vulnerable, not through fear, but through knowledge, clarity, and support. And although the journey was slow, uneven, and filled with resistance, it marks one of the most profound transformations in the care of children. The shift from a world where comfort was improvised in the darkness of a cramped household to a world where information, science, and shared responsibility illuminate the path forward. As the Victorian era drifted toward its later decades, the world around families began to shift in ways large and small. Shifts that were slow at first, like ripples spreading across a still pond, but eventually strong enough to reshape the entire landscape of childcare. And it is in these overlapping changes, rather than in a single moment of reform, that the quiet decline of soothing syrups and calming candies truly began. Because when society transforms, so do the habits it once accepted without question. The first of these changes emerged from the realm of medicine. As the 19th century progressed, the field began moving away from folklore and tradition, inching toward scientific structure. It was not yet the modern medical world we know today, but early steps were being taken. Hospitals were expanding. Universities were conducting more organized research. Doctors were beginning to share findings, compare case studies, and refine their understanding of the human body. For the first time, physicians started to grasp that children were not simply small adults, but possessed unique needs, vulnerabilities, and physiological responses. This realization alone shifted the tone of medical advice. Doctors began cautioning against strong remedies for infants. They encouraged gentler treatments, cleanliness, and closer observation of symptoms. And as more families sought medical guidance, even if only occasionally, this advice began to spread naturally through conversations among mothers, neighbors, and communities. Simultaneously, public health movements gained momentum. Cities were grappling with overcrowding, contaminated water sources, and the spread of disease. Reformers pushed for sanitation systems, cleaner streets, and safer living conditions. And as the public became increasingly aware of environmental causes of illness, trust in homemade or unregulated remedies began to falter. Families started connecting their children's health to factors beyond the home: the air they breathed, the water they drank, the food they ate. This expansion of awareness changed how they perceived causes of sickness and, inevitably, the remedies they reached for. Health was no longer seen solely as a private household matter. It was becoming a community and societal responsibility. Another profound shift occurred in how childhood itself was understood. Earlier in the Victorian era, children were viewed as miniature adults expected to work, behave, and endure hardships. But by the late 19th century, new ideas were circulating. Philosophers, educators, and physicians began arguing that childhood was a distinct, precious period of development, one that required protection, nurturing, and gentle guidance. Writers like Charles Dickens and reformers like Lord Shaftesbury painted vivid pictures of the suffering children endured in factories and streets. Their stories moved the public, stirring empathy and sparking social concern. The image of the child as fragile, innocent, and deserving of care spread through every layer of society. As this new understanding gained ground, parents began to reevaluate practices that had once seemed harmless. If childhood was something to be safeguarded, then the remedies used to calm children came under new scrutiny. Mothers began asking whether it was appropriate to quiet a crying child with a syrup. Doctors questioned whether stillness was always a sign of comfort. Educators wondered whether lethargy in students signaled something deeper. The cultural tide was turning, and in that tide, the old reliance on calming remedies began to feel outdated, out of sync with evolving values. At the same time, safer alternatives were emerging. Advances in herbal studies, milder formulations, and early pediatric medicines provided families with options that did not rely on the powerful substances of earlier decades. Even simple practices like warm compresses, improved nutrition, and better household hygiene offered genuine comfort to children without the risks associated with older syrups. Parents slowly discovered that some problems could be eased through gentler means, not immediately, not magically, but naturally. Economic changes also played a role. As industrial practices improved, wages gradually increased for some families. This did not eliminate poverty, far from it, but it provided slightly more stability. With more predictable earnings, families could afford occasional medical visits, cleaner food, and better living conditions. Improved housing gradually reduced the stressors that had once made calming remedies feel indispensable. Rooms became better insulated. Furniture improved. Children had a bit more space to rest, play, and heal. Education added another layer of change. As literacy rates rose, families gained access to pamphlets, newspapers, and health guides that explained childhood illnesses in clearer terms. Mothers' groups formed in cities, sharing advice grounded in emerging scientific understanding rather than inherited folklore. With each passing year, more families learned that crying was not always something to silence, but often a child's way of communicating discomfort, hunger, fear, or fatigue. And all the while, the legal reforms from earlier generations were maturing into stronger safety measures. Packaging regulations became stricter. Ingredient disclosures became mandatory. Some substances were restricted, then prohibited. Apothecaries underwent training that aligned more closely with standardized knowledge. Manufacturers faced increasing pressure to produce safer products. Slowly, the glossy glow that once surrounded soothing syrups began to fade. They no longer seemed like magical solutions. They became relics of an older, harsher world. As these changes accumulated, a generational shift followed. Younger mothers who grew up hearing reformers speak began raising their children differently. They were more cautious, more informed, more aware of alternatives. They had heard stories, quiet ones, whispered in kitchens and laundry rooms about remedies that had worked too well. Babies who slept too deeply, toddlers who never quite regained their energy. And even though these stories were often told without blame, they carried a warning, a gentle, painful warning that resonated more strongly than any advertisement's promise could. Grandmothers, too, began softening their advice. Instead of recommending syrups, they suggested herbal teas, or warm cloths, or simple comfort. The generational chain of remedy sharing broke, not abruptly, but naturally. As knowledge expanded and priorities changed, one by one, the old bottles disappeared from cupboards. Some remained tucked behind dusty jars, forgotten, Others were thrown away, quietly, without ceremony, just another part of tidying a home. A few were saved as curiosities, reminders of the old days, when life was harder and choices fewer. And for the first time in generations, children grew up without tasting those sweet, calming drops that had once been considered essential tools of parenting. What is striking about this transformation is its gentleness. It was not driven by fear or panic. It was driven by growth in knowledge, compassion, health, and social responsibility. The Victorian world did not suddenly reject its past. It simply learned, matured, and moved forward. By the time the 20th century opened its doors, childhood looked different. It was still far from easy, but it was recognized as a stage worth protecting. And in that new understanding, the era of unregulated soothing syrups and calming candies quietly came to an end. When we step back from the long corridor of Victorian homes, reformers, remedies, and quieted children, something profound rises to the surface, a realization that stretches far beyond this single historical chapter. It is the truth that parenting, more than almost anything else in human life, is shaped not only by love, but by the conditions of the world in which that love must survive. And those conditions change. Slowly, subtly, sometimes violently, sometimes gently, but always inevitably. What one generation sees as good care, the next may see differently. What one era accepts without question, another may view with disbelief. And when we observe the Victorian world through modern eyes, this becomes unmistakably clear. It is easy, from the comfort of the present, to look back with a sense of surprise, even shock, that soothing syrups and calming candies were ever used so widely. But if we step inside the lived reality of Victorian families, we see that their choices were shaped not by lack of love, but by lack of options. They lived in a world of relentless labor, chronic illness, minimal medical knowledge, and constant survival pressures. Quietness was not a luxury. It was a necessity. Sleep was not something to optimize. It was something to protect fiercely because it was scarce. Safety was not a checklist. It was a hope. In such an environment, the remedies we find unsettling today were tools that aligned with what parenting demanded at that moment in history. This awareness nudges us toward a bigger, more reflective truth. No society's parenting norms are fixed. They evolve alongside everything else, alongside technology, science, living conditions, cultural values, and the collective wisdom shared between generations. Victorian parents soothed their children with syrups because their world required immediate calmness. Modern parents calm their children with screen time, or pacifiers, or sleep training routines, each shaped by its own pressures and possibilities. And future generations may look back at us with the same mix of curiosity and disbelief we cast upon the Victorians, wondering why we relied on certain tools, certain habits, certain assumptions. What remains constant throughout history, though, is the tenderness that underlies parenting. Even when their choices seem foreign to us now, Victorian parents were motivated by the same emotions that guide parents today: love, worry, hope, exhaustion, uncertainty, and the desire to ease a child's distress. This is why their story resonates so deeply. Beneath the practices that changed lies a core that has never changed: the instinct to make a child feel safe, comforted, and cared for. When we understand this, our perspective shifts. Instead of judging the past, we witness it with empathy. Instead of seeing danger, we see context. Instead of assuming ignorance, we recognize constraints. And this recognition expands our understanding of the present, too. It invites us to consider how our own parenting norms may one day be re-examined. Modern childhood is full of tools and practices we take for granted. Devices, products, habits that feel normal because they fit our world. Yet some of these may one day seem outdated or even unwise as science evolves and society changes. That is not an indictment of the present. It is simply the natural rhythm of progress. The Victorian story teaches us that every generation does its best with what it has. It teaches us that parents are always negotiating between their love for their children and the environment they live in. And it teaches us that when society lacks support, parents rely on whatever tools are within reach, even if those tools carry hidden risks. It is a reminder that judgment without context is shallow, but understanding with empathy is profound. Another lesson emerges too, that norms shift not because individuals suddenly change their minds, but because the world around them changes first. When living conditions improved, when medicine advanced, when education expanded, when public health campaigns arose, when the idea of childhood-evolved parenting followed. This means that the burden of safer parenting does not fall solely on parents themselves. It falls on society to create conditions where healthy choices become the easiest choices. And so, as we observe Victorian mothers giving their children calming syrups, we do not see carelessness. We see the intersection of love and constraint. As we watch reformers raise early warnings, we see the beginnings of change driven by compassion. As we follow lawmakers gradually shaping regulations, we see society learning to protect its most vulnerable members. This slow, layered evolution reveals something incredibly human. We grow, we adjust, we learn, and we try always to do better for the children who depend on us. This is why the Victorian story matters, beyond its historical details. It is not simply about medicinal syrups or outdated remedies. It is about how societies grow in awareness, how parenting evolves, how knowledge expands, how empathy deepens, and how the definition of good care transforms as the world transforms. The story forces us to ask gentle but important questions. What practices do we accept today simply because they are convenient? What habits feel normal now only because they fit the pace of our lives? What assumptions do we hold that future generations may outgrow? And how much of what we see as safe, healthy, or responsible is shaped by science, and how much by culture? These questions do not accuse us. They invite us to reflect. They remind us that parenting is never static, that we are always part of a larger story of change. The Victorian chapter is only one part of that story, a window into a world where comfort was improvised from necessity, where science had not yet illuminated the path, and where parents lived with burdens we can scarcely imagine today. But in that world, as in ours, love found its way. It found its way through hardship, exhaustion, and fear. It found its way through mistakes, through hopes, through trial and error. It found its way in the soft rocking of a mother soothing a restless infant in the dim light of a candle. And even when the tools were imperfect, the intention behind them was full of heart. That is what remains most powerful in the Victorian story. Not the remedies that faded away, but the emotion that endured. The uncertainty of parenting, the longing to do right, the quiet courage required to raise children in a world that does not always make it easy. These are timeless truths. They belong not just to the Victorians, but to every generation. And so, as we drift gently out of this long, strange journey through Victorian life, The final threads of the story settle around us like a soft blanket after a long evening. We have walked through streets thick with fog and coal dust, stepped into cramped row houses where comfort was a luxury, watched parents improvise their way through exhaustion, and peeked into nursery cabinets filled with remedies that promised peace but carried shadows of risk. We have met children who grew up too quickly, doctors who worked with more confidence than knowledge, and families who lived each day in a world that demanded grit, creativity, and a quiet kind of courage. What stays with us after the jokes, the absurdities, the strange medicines, and the narrow hallways is something surprisingly tender. It is the simple reminder that even in the harshest eras, people were trying their best with the tools they had. That love, imperfect but sincere, is a constant across history. That every generation looks back at the last and thinks, I can't believe they lived that way, while forgetting that we are all works in progress, shaped by what we know, limited by what we do not, and held together by the same universal longing to keep the people we love safe, warm, and cared for. If there is a lesson we can take quietly with us into the night, it is this: human beings survive by learning, by adapting, and by caring for one another, even when the circumstances are far from ideal. History is not just a record of mistakes. It is a record of growth. And when we look at Victorian parents tired, overwhelmed, doing whatever they could in a world with very few safety nets, we are really looking at a mirror, one that gently reminds us to have empathy for the people who came before us, and grace for the people who are doing their best today. So take a breath. Let the images of foggy streets, candlelit rooms, and quiet cradles fade into a soft blur. Let your mind settle from the loudness of the past into the stillness of the present. You are here now, in a world that has changed in so many ways, and continues to change a little more each day. Thank you for spending this long, gentle journey with me tonight. I hope it brought you a sense of calm, curiosity, and maybe a little warmth in the quiet moments. If you are listening while winding down, I hope the rest of your night is peaceful and deeply restful. And if you are watching during the day, I hope the softness of this story stays with you for a while longer. Sleep well, take care of yourself, and as always, I will see you in the next story. It's Desplays. He's like in, but he was menaced in Drumston. Dawn, one, dawn, 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 dawn.